My concern is that some guys who don't experience short-term side effects of this may be experiencing either unconsciously behavioral and neurological side effects of things because it is changing the brain architecture. Some guys think that once you reach the optimal serum testosterone level, that you will feel the optimal benefits of TRT. This is not stupid. This makes sense because
it's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk.
Testosterone, it's not a stimulant, but it does activate the central nervous system. So a lot of the time guys will feel overstimulated, and if you've got an anxious mind, that overstimulation can be perceived and felt as anxiety. This can be challenging, and I often tell guys, during this period, particularly the first couple of weeks, which there can be a bit of a honeymoon, I go, look, use it. Go for a walk, do more physical activity. If you're feeling more activated and you can't sleep, go for a walk, do some push-ups, get some exercise, get into the physical body. The best way to get out of your mind is into the physical body. And then when we're looking at it from a protocol standpoint, when I've got guys who've never had optimal androgens before, I think the more frequent the administration can be, the better. Twice a week for cypionate and anthate works really well for a lot of guys, but if you've never had this surge before, I think sometimes it's better to start a bit more conservatively and increase the dose through titrating over time rather than just shooting straight for the moon. And then also maybe going for 3 injections a week. If guys want to do it daily, great, but a lot of guys don't want to do that. But I think 3 days a week rather than 2 days, starting a bit more conservative and then working up in small increments every 3 to 4 months, that's going to allow the subjective adjustment phase, which again, 6 to 12 months, but particularly the first few months, to be a lot more comfortable and also less prone to side effects. And then the other thing that these guys have to learn, and this is something that I speak about a lot, is that when you are hypergonadal, you will often maladapt the stress from that with coping mechanisms. So things like, drinking alcohol or eating too much junk food or having a poor diet and lifestyle. If you optimize your testosterone levels to, the upper end of where they should be, you have to come in and start living in a way that you would be making those levels naturally if you could. Otherwise, you've now created a disconnect. You've created a body that would never have optimal testosterone levels, and now you're pumping them in. So this is what causes side effects. So the thing that I try to teach them over this period is you have to now meet the medicine halfway. You have to show up in a way that you would be optimizing your natural levels if you were making them naturally. And that's why the natural testosterone optimization stuff is the same as the treatments for getting rid of side effects on TRT. It's dropping body fat, dropping vices, eating well, moving more, having good cardiovascular fitness. You can't have optimal testosterone levels and get out of breath climbing upstairs, because you would never be having those optimal testosterone levels if you had poor cardiovascular fitness. And that discrepancy between what you would be making and what you're taking will show up as side effects.
That's a very good point. So in that scenario there, we've got that, say, 3 to 6 month period where these acute effects are setting in. What should people be expecting to see in terms of positives there versus the longer, more genetic based effects that are going to take place 6, 12, 18, 24 months and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the clinical outcomes that we're trying to achieve with TRT, we're looking at the effects from prolonged exposure to androgens over time. This is what we're looking to improve. Things like basically restoring you and turning you into the man that you should have been all along. And that's a process that takes time. Puberty took years. TRT, the effects of TRT takes years. However, the acute subjective benefits that you can receive at the start, a welcome change when you've had low testosterone for a while, and I'm sure you can attest to that as I can as well. The benefits that we're looking, so I like to kind of put things out, and if we're looking at a graph to go, okay, let's say that we break the benefits down into feeling better mentally, feeling better, I don't want to use the word spiritually, but feeling more like masculine, feeling that kind of androgenic, well-being sense, improved immune system, improved, muscle hypertrophy, reduced body fat, as long as you're training and eating properly, of course. And then libido and sexual function. That's the big one that a lot of guys talk about. The problem is, well, not the problem, the reality and the limitation of TRT is that libido is impacted by everything else in your psychology, physiology. It's the downstream effect of everything. Libido is a signal for you to reproduce. So if you're in a survival state, your body's not going to signal you to reproduce. So what I like to say to guys, and this turns out to be very true, is that over the 6 months, all of these graphs will start to move up at different points. Typically, people start to feel energized first. They feel more activated. Maybe they feel a bit more confident. Maybe they go, oh, now that diet and training program, I'm actually getting the results I should have been getting the whole time, which I wasn't. The last one that moves is libido. So sometimes you can get like a surge of libido for the first couple of weeks because you get this dopaminergic response from your body being like, holy crap, there's a whole bunch of testosterone here that I've never had before. But the sexual benefits of testosterone, they start to move for some guys after 3 to 6 months, and then can really take multiple years to truly take effect. And one of the big mistakes guys make is they get, let's say 6 months in, and they go, I had a massive libido surge at the start, and now I'm kind of closer to where I was before. And I'll turn around and go, do you feel 20% better than you felt before you started? Oh yeah, I feel at least 20%. Cool, that's a win. That's not a bad thing. Some guys think that once you reach the optimal serum testosterone level, that you will feel the optimal benefits of TRT. This is not stupid. This makes sense because with any other drug or medication you take, when it reaches peak serum levels, that's when you feel it the most. Your pre-workout, you feel the most when it peaks in your system. Testosterone, what you're hoping to achieve and feel is the prolonged exposure to that level for months and years. So that can be the thing that guys can sometimes be a little bit disappointed with, but also just need a reality check, which is that the libido is the last thing that's going to come to fruition. But in the interim, all the other benefits should just be gradually going up over time.
Sure. So considering that, when do you start looking at potentially adjusting a dosage? Because if we have that initial phase where thing just is like wildfire and, they're reacting like crazy, and then we get this patience that's required then for this equilibrium and for everything to creep up, what would really be a sensible time period then for you to actually assess the effect that specific dose is having?
Yeah, cool. This is a great question. So people have different ways of doing this. The late Dr. John Crisler used to say there's an art and a science to TRT. Very, very, very true. I say there's multiple ways to skin a cat because I think that saying's funnier, but different ways to do things. The way that I recommend that we do it, so again, I'm going to talk about reference ranges because the units that people will be looking at are very different, and I always get them wrong when I'm in a podcast. So the optimal testosterone level for TRT is somewhere between the top quartile of the range and double the top of the range. With the range where it is now, maybe it's even triple the top of the range. It's getting that low. So that's a big range, but we're also looking at a big patient population. You've got everyone from 18-year-olds to 80-year-olds with every level of health. So there should be a big range. I think, and again, this is coming from years of coaching experience, having a couple of clinics, doing a lot of this, I think the best course of action, and people may disagree, but that's cool, is that we should shoot, assuming the guy is in relatively good health, shoot for about the top of the range to start with, because that is generally going to be 3 to 4xing their testosterone levels. That's a lot. That may not be the end destination, and for a lot of younger guys, it absolutely isn't. But the way that I like to do it is to shoot for about the top of the reference range to begin with. I can already feel people freaking out because I'm talking about staying within the reference range, but shooting for the top of the reference range, which for most guys, assuming you respond averagely, is about 120 to about 160 milligrams per week of testosterone, divided into 2 to 3 shots. And then once you get to that point, I like to let it settle there for a good 3 to 4 months and go, okay, we've given it 8 to 12 weeks to build up. Your levels are about in that point. Let's let it settle. And then when they come back after that point, their body's taking time to adjust. We'll see how they're feeling. And if they're going, hey, everything feels fantastic, everything feels awesome, cool. If it ain't broke, don't fix. That's fantastic, because more is not better past a certain point for each guy. And what will happen is guys will come in and go, oh, I want to up my dose. And then they'll come back and they'll be like, oh, now I have all these side effects. And it's like, well, this is why you don't pick your own dose, bro. So at that point, if they come back, so let's say they've been on, they've been in this kind of top of the range, give or take by a quartile, and they're going, yeah, I feel like there's some room for improvement here. That's when I think titration should begin up. I like to titrate by 5 to 10 milligrams per injection. So that would typically look like, 10 to 30 milligrams per week. I think titrating by any more than that causes kind of like a whiplash effect. So it's not that that could take you too high, it's that you get too high too quick. So I like to titrate by, again, averages by about 15 to 25 milligrams a week every 3 to 4 months until we reach that sweet spot where they feel good. The thing with the TRT dosing is that you can always bring it up and bring it down. Like, you don't have to go, once I get there, then I can't come back down. It's like, no, you can come back down. We can adjust this to a point that it feels good. And the most important thing that we're looking at is not so much what is that testosterone number on paper, it's how does the rest of the blood work look, particularly things like the holistic relationship between like lipids, liver panel, red blood cell count, blood pressure, sleep, all of these factors as well, and also seeing how they're feeling day to day. If you take too much testosterone, yeah, you'll feel like a beast in the gym, but you'll also sweat like a motherfucker after you eat. Your sleep will go to shit. There's a whole bunch of side effects that come if you go past that sweet spot. So titrating up in increments of, as I said, 10 to 30 milligrams every 3 to 4 months after they've taken about, 3 to 6 months to settle into the starting dose to begin with, I think is the best way to play it.
Sure. And how much variation do you see? First, in terms of what number ends up being optimal for that person, but also how that person responds to X dosage. So, like, you put all three of us on 200 milligrams per week,
Sure.
And the response you see in terms of testosterone level in response to that.
Yeah.
How much variation is there at a population level?
Sure. So I wrote a book about this a couple of years ago called TRT 101, and I'm happy to say that it's aged like wine. It's aged. I stand by everything in that book. So I have found that there is about 8 out of 10 guys will respond about the same, within a striking distance of the same kind of levels. 1 out of 10 guys will shoot through the roof, taking next to nothing. I have guys who are taking like 70 milligrams a week, and their levels are as high as the average guy taking 250. Those guys are lucky. Like, that's awesome. I also have guys who are taking 300 milligrams a week, and they're barely hitting the top of the reference range. So I find that 8 out of 10 about the same. 1 in 10 hyper responder, 1 in 10 hypo responder, meaning low. But 8 out of 10 fall into the same category. And that's why, so in Australia and Europe, we compound testosterone at 250 milligram per mil. I think 150 per week is a good starting dose for most guys. SHBG is a factor. There's other factors that will impact that because it divides into 0.2 mil 3 times a week or 0.3 mil twice a week. It makes it easier to do. And that will typically give someone a total testosterone of about 25 to 35 nanomole per liter. I'm not sure what the conversion is into the numbers that you guys use over here, but that's about the top of the range, give or take. That works really well. Now, in terms of response to the numbers on paper, the other side of it, that varies more. And that's where it's kind of more of a mix. And when we're looking at, again, talking about the free testosterone relative to the reference range, I do find that, again, it's not a perfectly correlated variable, but age is a factor. It seems the younger the guy, the higher they need their free testosterone to be to resolve their symptoms. That makes sense. Plus, if a guy is symptomatic at a relatively higher level, then it makes sense that he needs his free testosterone to be higher to achieve symptom resolution. I have some guys where if you take them above the top of the reference range, they get those I call it cranked, which is like you have too much energy in a bad way. It's like you're overstimulated, but it's uncomfortable. It's like too much caffeine side effects. Anywhere above the reference range, they feel like that. I have other guys where until they get to double the top of the reference range, they feel like it's not doing anything. And that's when they've got all their other lifestyle factors in check as well. So I find that the younger they are, the healthier they are, the more they benefit from the higher end testosterone levels. And when you get the older guys, that's a little bit more correlated with doing better lower. But there are so many exceptions to the rule that it's like a loose correlation. So more variance.
How does that change because you touched on this a little bit earlier, if you're working with somebody that basically was blasting shit for a decade.
Yeah.
Right. And now they want to kind of move into the TRT, where to them you're going to say 70 milligrams a week and they're going to laugh and spit in your face and shit like that. But you noted before that their decrease in the thyroid and DHEA and D. Yeah. What are some of the other things that will result if their dose has been over 1,000 milligrams per week for a decade.
Sure.
And then they start to, basically, I don't want to say do they build immunity,
Yeah.
to that higher dose to where they're going to need higher doses, or will they be able to come down to lower doses?
So the literature says that androgen receptors upregulate when they're agonized. So if we use an example like amphetamine you build a tolerance to because your dopamine receptors downregulate. So you need more to achieve the effect. The literature says that androgen receptors upregulate when you agonize them with something like testosterone. So in theory, guys who've been blasting gear should be more sensitive or should be no less sensitive than other guys. That's not the case in practice, but that's what the literature says. In practice, when guys have been, cruising on like 500 milligrams a week plus for years, maybe even decades, they definitely need more than a guy who's never had optimal testosterone levels before, because and this is just my theory, their body has been conditioned around a much higher androgen environment. So if you take a guy who's been on, 500 milligrams a week and you bring him down to like, 120 a week, that's probably going to feel pretty terrible for him. Now, would he level out there over time? Maybe, but I haven't seen that be the case. I think that when a guy's been on higher doses for a prolonged period, that's when we want to work him down into still a physiological range, which I think the physiological range is still 2 to 3 times the top of the reference range. But I think those guys are more looking at, again, if they're an average responder, we're looking at doses of like 200, 250, sometimes 300 milligrams a week. So the higher end of TRT, because and some people, like, there seems to be there's not really like a hard line in the sand where it's like below here is TRT and above here is steroids. And people like to go, well, the line's here, or lines, there's no line, there's just a blurry mess in the middle. But when we look at testosterone optimization, testosterone is healthy for you up until the point that it's not. And in science, we call this an inverse U-shaped response, which is that too little shit, too much is shit, different kind of shit. But there's a sweet spot in the middle. But once you pass that sweet spot, you get problems, just like if there's too little, you get problems as well. And if you've been taking a large amount for a while, if you're also trying to maintain a super physiological amount of muscle mass as well, you're not going to do that on a low-end TRT dose. So it is important that if these guys are like, hey, and this is where it's so important to provider who knows what they're doing and to be transparent, is like, I want to be able to take the higher-end TRT dose that's going to not jeopardize my health, but that's going to allow me to get the best performance out of my training and maintain the best muscle mass and the best feeling of well-being. I advocate that for everyone, because that's what's been the most therapeutic for me, and that's been what's been the most therapeutic for a lot of my clients as well. And that's where it's really important to go, okay, let's say a guy's going to take, 250 a week, for example. That's when it's really important that we're monitoring all those other blood markers to go, are you actually tolerating this? Which is, what's your blood pressure? What's your red blood cell count? Are your lipids out of whack? Are your liver enzymes out of whack? Where's your EGFR? And if those things are all optimal and within, healthy range, I found it very interesting for myself. I got started like years ago before I knew what I was doing originally I got started on 250 a fortnight, but once I kind of got a decently competent practitioner, I was on 175 a week, split into 2 shots. And when I pushed it up to 250, which for me brings me right up to about double the top of the reference range, all my other health markers improved. So I didn't get, my blood pressure went down, my EGFR went up, my liver enzymes went down, my triglycerides went down, my LDL went down, my red blood cell count went down. All of these things that people would associate with taking too much testosterone, it went the inverse direction. So I think that it's important that we find the healthy dose for everyone. And for someone who's been taking a lot for a while, I think that's still going to be a higher end TRT dose. Yeah.
What are some of the other biomarkers that can be disrupted because of that long-term higher dose?
I think if someone's been on a long-term high dose for a while, I think we're going to learn more about the detriments of that by scanning the organs and running blood work. Blood work for me, and this is how I think blood work should be viewed by everyone, but a lot of people have a degree in Redditology who think that blood work is the be-all and end-all of health. I see so many people obsessing about, oh, this lipid means this and this. Just go get it scanned and see what's actually going on in there, because that's what you're using it as a proxy for. Blood work is really just a tool for us to go, do we need to scan this? And then we can actually know what's going on there. So I think if someone's been running too much test for too long, or anabolics for too long, we're going to be looking at heart enlargement. Potentially, we're going to be looking at sluggish kidneys, and we're going to be potentially looking at some liver swelling as well, and hypertension. Those are probably the big ones that we're going to be looking at, as well as prolonged disrupted sleep cycles as well, and that can elevate things like hemoglobin and hematocrit too. Those are the main things that I see. When I see blood work of someone who's like, let's say their sweet spot for TRT is like 200 to 250, but they're taking like 300 to 350, like they're overdoing it, but not, shooting through the moon. We tend to see hematocrit spike. We see LDL spike. Sometimes triglycerides can spike. AST and ALT will spike without training the day before. Sometimes GGT will go up and EGFR will go down. That's what I typically see.
Sure. In those populations, you said about them needing a higher dose, and it's not the androgen receptor. Do you have any theories about what is causing that desensitization or that increased need? Is there some kind of aromatization or SHBG input or something that's meaning that they need more in that regard?
I think there's two factors going on for that. I think, and my friend Dr. Keith Nichols has spoken about this before me. He taught me this as well, is that, and a lot of people have observed the same thing. It seems that exogenous testosterone is not as effective as endogenous testosterone, meaning let's say somehow you had two identical twins and one had a free testosterone at the top of the range naturally and the other one had a free testosterone at the top of the range on TRT. I think the natural guy is going to be getting a better androgenic response to that. Why that is, no idea. But we observe that. I assume that when you make testosterone internally, maybe it metabolizes better, maybe there are so many factors as to why that could be. But it seems that exogenous testosterone is less efficient when we're looking at blood markers than internal testosterone, just from observation. So I think that's a factor. The other factor, though, I think it is, and again, Keith taught me about this too. This has been researched, so you can look it up. It's called androgen resistance. And this is the idea that some people, and I would argue younger people, have worse androgen receptor expression. And potentially they could also have upregulation of estrogen receptors as well. Maybe, we don't really know. But there seems to be that the plausible theory that I have for why, Bob needs double the amount of testosterone as John to feel the same benefits is that Bob's androgen receptors are not as sensitive, or there's not as many of them. It would be one of those two. It'd be netting less androgen receptor activity from X dose of testosterone. And I think that is an outcome of the environmental factors. Probably the same thing that caused the levels to potentially be low in the first place is potentially the same thing that's leading to that. So it seems to be it seems that there's both at play, but there seems to be a receptor issue going on there. And then when we look at factors going, well, how can we upregulate these receptors? That's when diet is really important. Things like carnitine, creatine, choline, surprise, surprise, all the things that you get from eating meat, which is good for you. Fat-soluble vitamins, so vitamins A, E, D, K. These nutrients are very important in androgen receptor expression, as well as thyroid hormone as well.
Do you think with the PED using population chronically, some kind of cortisol, there's a cortisol player in there? Because as far as my awareness is that when you're putting a lot of exogenous androgens into a system, the body will usually upregulate cortisol, but it doesn't matter so much because all the receptor sites, which they both bind to, are being taken up by the exogenous. And again, that could be wrong. But what I'm saying is, if that is right, and someone's injecting a gram of test for 5 years, you've got the body pumping out cortisol for forever with no real effect because they're masking it. And now, as we're coming down, there could be some kind of prolonged, almost PCT style, coming off. Do you think maybe that could just last really long in people that have been on for a long time?
Yeah, and this stuff's really interesting because we have no fucking idea. And it's such a, bodybuilders who are taking these drugs are just the ultimate guinea pigs that we're learning from and observing from, and that's why I love working with them, because it's fascinating when they come to you with these situations. This is where I will often see the downregulation of pregnenolone and DHEA. And I think that this is when it comes to the symptoms of when they come off, grams of, let's say, they're using like nandrolone, tren, maybe they're using some oral like Anavar or Winstrol or whatever, and they're running these big cycles. And they come back down to like, let's say 250 milligrams of testosterone, and they're going, why do I feel like crap on something that should make me feel at least pretty damn good? Maybe not as good as King Kong levels, but, you've got the testosterone levels of the 0.01 percentile of the population. You should feel damn good. And it would seem that from observation, again, this isn't based on research because we don't have the studies on this, but it seems that the pregnenolone and DHEA downregulation, which, we think of DHEA as an adrenal hormone, as a testicular or steroid hormone, but it is an adrenal hormone primarily. It seems that the downregulation of these hormones could be at play with why these people are not feeling well. I think the one thing that people often don't consider is that when we're looking at these anabolic steroids, which are analogs of mainly DHT, as well as nandrolone, but mainly DHT, is that just like with female birth control, which is a progestin, which is an analog of progesterone, is that these things bind to the receptor and they look like the androgen, like DHT, and they do a lot of the stuff that it does, but they don't have the same downstream metabolites. And it's the downstream metabolites of these hormones that have this really important balancing constant effect with the rest of your biology. And I think that some of the side effects that guys get from running cycles for prolonged periods, particularly with things like mood and sleep and like brain fog and sometimes digestion as well, is because they've now got these lack of these endogenous metabolites of things like DHT and estrogen, which they're basically throwing their body out of balance, and then they're experiencing the body being out of balance. And I think that contributes.
You noted with the long-term use, the impact on organs.
Uh-huh.
What would be the long-term impact on brain?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So as we spoke about before, my main area of interest is the brain. I don't believe that anabolic steroids are carcinogenic. I think they could be, though. And when we're looking at studies on anabolic steroids, the problem is that they're run in isolation. So if you're natural and then you just start taking like 200, 300 milligrams a week of tren with nothing else, which I hope no one would ever do. But that's what they do in these studies, is you shut down your natural production. So you now have zero endogenous testosterone, DHT, estrogen floating around. That's neurotoxic in and of itself. So if they note things like neurotoxicity from these anabolic steroids in isolation, it's a big contributing factor is the fact that there is no endogenous testosterone underneath. So I also am not that optimistic or naive that I think that if you run a test based that now all of a sudden you can take all this gear and it not be neurotoxic. It's not really clear what the impacts are long term. There's definitely concerns that it could lead to things like early onset dementia because it could be neurologically toxic to the brain tissue. I don't think we have data based on how guys are using these compounds at the moment to ascertain what the reality of that is. And I also think that some guys throwing caution to the wind with going, oh, well, as long as I'm taking my 6 or 7 over-the-counter supplements from iHerb or Amazon that I can now offset grams of gear's worth of use. I think that's, that's like wearing a blazer as a bulletproof vest. It's really optimistic. I'm sure some stuff absolutely helps, but I think that there's a risk to reward, and I think some guys aren't factoring in risk. And that's why when I get guys come to me who are wanting to take steroids or take large doses of these compounds, and I really speak to them and go, when you're 40 or 50 or 60, if there are consequences to this that we don't fully understand at this stage, are you going to be okay with that? Or do you maybe just want to optimize your testosterone level? And this is the other thing is, if you're running your TRT too low, you're always going to want to take more. But if you can get your testosterone up to the optimal level, like testosterone optimization therapy, I would argue that is when you are going to feel your best 24/7 round the clock. And I think if you want to step on the stage of the Olympia, like I was just at the Olympia, you can't do that with TRT. Or if you're wanting to set records in non-drug tested competitions, then you're going to have that trade-off. But I think for a lot of guys who are wanting to take all these things, what they're actually subjectively wanting to achieve and experience, unless it's those goals, they can achieve by just optimizing their testosterone replacement therapy. One thing that I see a lot is guys on TRT aren't taking enough And I know that that's a really unpopular angle in this space, but heaps of guys are underdoing their TRT, to stay within the reference range. And that's what's leading them to want to go and take more and more and more. Whereas if you can optimize your testosterone replacement therapy protocol, if I go and take a bit of primobolan, or like even oral primobolan, like Proviron, like the compounds that typically feel the best, they all make me feel worse. All of them, because my testosterone, there's no room in my body for more testosterone. I'm maxed out. Back when I was first starting my treatment, I used 25 milligrams of Proviron a day for over a year straight, because I didn't realize that I wasn't taking enough testosterone. I thought, I need a bit more DHT, I need a bit more this, bit more this. So if you can optimize your testosterone treatment, you want to get to the point that more androgens past the level that you're at create negatives. And I think that optimal testosterone level is where we should be aiming to optimize TRT to.
What if we look at the brain consequences of the reverse? What are the risks for brain health for people who have low testosterone in the long term?
It seems that, so when we look at, if we even go beyond that and look at the diseases of aging, which is 4 primary diseases of aging, which is diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and dementia, which are all have one thing in common, which is they all involve to some degree insulin resistance. Dementia is sometimes referred to as type 3 diabetes, or diabetes of the brain. So sex hormones, in men primarily testosterone, and in women way more complicated, but particularly progesterone is implicated in this, is that these hormones are very neuroprotective, and they're very important for energy metabolism in the brain. When the brain is not receiving proper energy, it literally physiologically becomes depressed. So not only do you feel subjectively worse, your brain doesn't fire properly, but this can also lead to increased degradation of brain tissue, shifting of gray matter and white matter, and it seems that this will age the brain at an accelerated rate. And that's why I'm such a big advocate for testosterone replacement therapy done properly, is that if it's done correctly, and again, the way that you do it correctly is meeting the medicine halfway and living healthfully as if you would be making those levels naturally if you could, it should be protective against all of these situations. So when we look at the effect of low testosterone in the brain, not only are we looking at reduced energy metabolism, insulin resistance neurologically, but again, coming back to that cortisol adrenaline thing, we're also looking at more stress hormone activation. So subjectively, the brain is going to feel more anxious, more like monkey mind. The GABA and glutamate ratio is also very important for how you're subjectively thinking and feeling. That's going to get all shot to shit. But the brain is going to age faster, and it's not going to function as well as it should. And that's why going on TRT, when someone's hypergonadal, people often note that their brain fog is gone and they feel more mentally at peace. Like their mind is less like, and it's just more still and stoic. That, I think, is very therapeutic, both subjectively, but also long-term for brain health too.
You mentioned the GABA glutamate axis there, which is something I find interesting. So I just want to ask you about that. How much of that axis being off kilter, in most scenarios, glutamate being way too high, do you think is at least partial explanation for a lot of the behavioral issues, for want of a better term, that we maybe see in the population now? As in, like, for want of being triggered too easily, being more emotionally driven, however you want to sum it up, what I'm kind of referring to there.
Yeah. The GABA and glutamate ratio is really interesting. So GABA and glutamate are both metabolites of glutamine, which, as people know, is like an amino acid. You get it from protein, helps with recovery, stuff like that. So GABA is your brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it's what drugs like alcohol, benzodiazepines, that's what they work on. It sedates things, brings things down. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmission. So it's not like, dopamine or something like this, which feels good. It's just overactivity in the brain. And both are important in balance. Sometimes when it comes to neurology, we go, this one's good, this one's bad. Dopamine good, cortisol bad. They're all really fucking important. We sometimes get a bit myopic with things. But the ratio of these is very important. And when this ratio is out of balance, typically it's what's called excitotoxic, which means that the brain is basically firing haphazardly, and then you're consciously embodying that, being alive. And this, for a lot of people, will feel like an overly anxious, like a hair trigger stress response, and a monkey mind, the inability to calm and keep the mind still. And one of the main hormones that's very important, there's two main hormones that's very important for GABA signaling. One is allopregnanolone, which is the 5-alpha reduced form of progesterone. And the other one is, I can't pronounce it, but it's one of the metabolites of DHT. So both of these hormones are contingent on 5-alpha reductase. And when guys take drugs like dutasteride and finasteride, which block 5-alpha reductase expression, my concern is that some guys who don't experience short-term side effects of this may be experiencing either unconsciously behavioral and neurological side effects of things because it is changing the brain architecture, but it could also be causing excitotoxicity over years and decades, which I think is something that we're going to discover down the track, is that these drugs may also accelerate early onset dementia. That's just a theory, though.
How much of an effect do you think lifestyle and also diet, especially additives, are having on that axis? Because obviously we all know about like monosodium glutamate, which now is kind of the devil, so they sneak it in the form of glutamic acid and other things. Are those things, in your opinion, having a meaningful effect? I think
they're all contributing as well. Like, I read the ingredient labels of like the food in the supermarket here, and it's terrifying. Like this, in the Baltics, like this shit just doesn't exist, and it's everywhere over here. It's mental. So I think that all of these things, the artificial colors, the artificial sweeteners, the artificial flavors, things like MSG, which is what you mentioned before, all of these things as well, which can contribute to gut inflammation, so potentially like genetically modified gluten that you have a lot of over here, the solvents that they even use for natural flavors. I mean, I think all of this stuff is, going back to like the pollution, the plastics, the pesticides, I think all of this stuff is just adding and adding and adding and adding and adding to this toxic burden. I wouldn't be surprised if like when people adopt, things like carnivore diets, or even like, like a whole food plant-based vegan diet, which I'm not an advocate for, but, when people adopt this by default, they tend to cut out a whole bunch of this artificial crap that's in the processed food. And I think that is also a contributing factor as to why people feel better, either end of the extreme that they go with these diets, is because they're getting rid of all that processed junk. And, over here, like, I never do like meal prep and stuff like that when I'm at home, but here, like, I chop it with meals, like I'm conscious of what I'm eating, like I'm reading the ingredient labels, because when you don't have this stuff ever, because it just doesn't exist in the country that I live in, and you come here and you have it, you feel it. Like whereas for people over here, I assume it's very normal, but those food additives, we don't know if a tiny little bit of them is making a difference, because we can go, well, mechanistically it's toxic, but then the amount that you're consuming is so small that it probably doesn't do anything, and that's a lot of people's argument. Over a lifetime, we don't know. And I'm a big believer when it comes to synthetic artificial shit that we're looking at guilty until proven innocent, not innocent until proven guilty.
Sure. So we've spoken a lot about testosterone, obviously, because we all love testosterone, we all want more. What about the role of estrogen in TRT? How big of a role does that play? What do you see in terms of good and bad practice, in terms of AIs or like demonization of estrogen and so on?
Yeah, it's an interesting field. When I got into TRT many years ago, it was everyone took, either a quarter of a milligram or half a milligram of anastrozole twice a week to keep your estrogen within a sweet spot. Over time, that has changed now, and now there seems to be kind of like a tribal divide between people who are pro-AI use, anti-AI use. There are people who think that some people are genetic over-aromatizers. Spoiler, there's no such thing as a genetic over-aromatizer. You're just fat, or you're drinking too much alcohol. This is just the way it is. And when it comes to aromatase, when we look at what aromatase is, so firstly, if someone is doing a physiological hormone replacement therapy with testosterone, we are mimicking the correct amount of testosterone that should be in the body. This should not require or necessitate aromatase inhibition. Otherwise, the healthy 20, 21-year-old athletes would also have to take aromatase inhibitors. So a big part of why people are needing these to fix the side effects they're having is because they're taking big boluses and they're giving themselves big roller coasters, which men are not meant to have, or they're taking too much of it. I think that if you're taking like, 500 milligrams a week, a gram a week of testosterone, like, people say, oh, you want to take a whole bunch of primobolan or something like that to offset the effects of estrogen. I don't know how people think that's healthier. It's still antagonizing the shit inside the body anyway. So I think when we're talking about PED cycles, if people are going to do that stuff, I think it's all unhealthy, and aromatase inhibitors probably have a role in that. It's not something I do. But when it comes to hormone optimization therapy, I think that we should be looking at the side effects that men are having, because the important thing that often gets overlooked is that guys are going, I'm having these side effects, and the practitioner's going, it's not estrogen, you never need to block aromatase, the aromatase inhibitors have no place. Cool, they've still got side effects, they've still got problems, and we need to work out how to fix these issues. In my experience, all of those issues come down to, and Jay Campbell has been a big advocate for this, is insulin resistance is driving increased aromatase expression. That's a big one. Too much alcohol consumption and hypothyroidism. Those ones account for, and excess body fat kind of comes with all of those as well. All of those, in my experience, account for all the side effects that we see from excess estrogen on TRT. The way around it is, firstly, you increase frequency. So I used to sell mobile phones when I was at university, and when someone came in with a phone problem, we'd say, have you turned it off and turned it back on? Increasing injection frequency is the turn it off and turn it back on TRT. It doesn't solve every problem, but it's a really easy place to start.
For me, it was the dopamine effect and the effect on the dopamine receptors. For me, that made the big difference.
If you meditate consistently daily for 8 to 12 weeks, which 90% of people will not do because it's uncomfortably boring, the prefrontal cortex will physically get bigger and the amygdala will physically get smaller. So we're actually able to change the architecture.